Welcome, everybody. It's so lovely to see you all. I just wish we were in a room together so we could actually see each other properly rather than these little squares on Zoom. But I am excited to be here this afternoon, evening, to discuss the climate crisis and its impact on women. Ever since I first started getting active in the environmental movement, I have been so inspired by the strength and energy of other women activists. And I'm really, really grateful to Extinction Rebellion, particularly Miranda of Exile Families, for opening up this space for some women to come together and really discuss the intersection between feminism and the climate emergency. I feel very privileged to be hosting this discussion with women who are true inspirations to me. They're women who have so much experience of working for women's rights, of working on the front line of the climate emergency. They've got a lot of experience and a lot of opinions to share with you. I also know that you in the audience have got a lot to share. So I'm hoping that we will move on to a discussion quite soon after we've heard from each of our wonderful speakers. So please start thinking about your questions, have them ready. We'll be using the chat, and also you'll be able to put your hand up to make live contributions. We only have an hour, so let's dive right in. Our first speaker is joining us all the way from South Africa, Zukiswa White. She works at the intersections of gender equity, racial justice, and sustainable development. She's got years of experience working across local, national, regional coalitions. At the moment, she works with the Women and Gender Constituency, which is an official constituency in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She's a member also of several grassroots movements in South Africa and regionally, including the African Feminist Task Force and the Southern African Development Community Network. Zukiswa, I'd love to ask you just to open up for us this evening and let us know, how do you see the climate emergency having an impact on women? And how does that play out with the communities that you work with?
Sorry, hi everybody. I'm dealing with childcare. So I hope that I was trying to sort out, it's about 6 p.m. this side. Thank you so much for the invitation. Hello once again to my fellow speakers and to everyone joining us, whether morning, evening, or afternoon. So I'd like to start, I suppose, by, grounding the discussion to make the point, firstly, that the intersection between gender justice and, climate and environmental justice is absolutely crucial, right? The links, are bare for all of us to see, and an approach, that is going to be meaningful and effective cannot avoid that intersection between gender and climate, right? I say this because we know that the climate emergency, which is one of the foremost crises of our present day, it entrenches existing inequalities, right? So whether you're talking about, the floods in Pakistan, the crisis in Mozambique, the crisis in South Africa, we know that the people that often bear the brunt of the responsibility and burden of rebuilding, oftentimes in contexts where there is no institutional or state support, are the people that are women who are caregivers, not just to their own children and families, but to the communities at large. So in a system that we have today, which is, governed by neoliberal global imperialist capitalism, we know that if there is a challenge, right, the people that ultimately suffer the most are women, because we are the caregivers. And so if I give you an example, and I think what people often might not understand, especially in developed countries, is that for many of us in the global south, the climate crisis is not just about, it's getting too hot, or we must stop polluting the oceans. The climate crisis is very much a housing crisis, is very much a, access crisis, is very much a food crisis, and all these other things that we might not readily be able to make the connections with. So if someone who is caring for 5 kids, for example, it could be a grandmother who has had to care for her for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren because the mother is in the city somewhere trying to get work, and the kids are in the village, right? That grandmother or that mother is when a flood hits the community or the village, it doesn't just become about, what do we do when they move us to another place while they're trying to rebuild? And this is in the best case scenarios. Oftentimes governments in the global south aren't equipped to be able to respond and preempt these kinds of challenges. And this is precisely why, for example, the demand around loss and damages is ever so crucial, that those who are most responsible for the crisis, which is countries that are most developed, whose development has happened on the back of global south countries, must be responsible to ensure that they give unconditional support in the form of resources to global south countries who are feeling the brunt of this, to be able to build the kinds of resilience that is needed to ensure that we can survive the climate crisis, firstly, but also that we are at the forefront of the decision making that's going to enable us to take full advantage of what crisis often does if it is handled correctly and responsibly, which is usher us into a different future that is not so bound to the brutality of capitalism, that is not so bound to the brutality of, the unfairness of the market economy, as well as, the unfairness of, the global political economy. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying, I know I have 3 minutes, there is so much to unpack, but it's to say that when we think about, the climate emergency, we are thinking about housing, right? A sustainable housing for people. We are thinking about food sovereignty. We're moving away from talking about food security. Countries, sovereign states must be able to self-define and be able to cater for their own resources. And when we're talking about the climate crisis, we are talking about capitalism, right? And social security for poor and working class people. And all of these things, right, I've mentioned just a few, are absolutely connected to gender, because like I said earlier, what the climate crisis has done, much like, for example, the pandemic as another example, is make bare the extent of existing inequalities. And therefore, if we are going to respond meaningfully and responsibly, we cannot avoid the intersection of gender in formulating a response that is going to take us forward, because it is women and girls who are disproportionately, responsible for, households and families in moments of crises, and therefore it does not make sense to negate the gender question when we talk about climate. I don't want to go in too deep on how they are disproportionately affected, because I know my colleague Helen will go more into it, but let's keep it here for now, right? That because it is a crisis that is entrenching existing inequalities, how we respond to this absolutely must take account, of existing intersections, gender being one of them, race, geography, ability, etc., being part of them. And so a feminist analysis to the climate crisis is one of the key tools that, if global governments are serious and actors who are within the ecosystem are serious, need to take us seriously, and the analysis that we are offering as feminists around the world to say that this is how we should move forward. I will hand over to my colleagues and pick it up once we get the conversation going. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful opening. That was amazing, Zukiswa. I just feel this is what we need to hear and think much more deeply about, I think, here in the UK and across the global north. We really need to hear more about those structural inequalities and think about what it is actually to show solidarity. So obviously, I know those are just opening remarks, and I hope there's going to be more opportunity, obviously, for you to expand on some of those issues for us later in the event. But our next speaker is Helen Pankhurst. Obviously, Helen Pankhurst brings with her an incredible legacy in women's rights and activism as the great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst. And her grandmother, Sylvia Pankhurst, was very active, not only in women's suffrage, but also in movements for social justice and anti-colonialism. Helen is an author, most recently of Deeds Not Words. She's a campaigner, including for women's equality in Parliament, and has long worked with international non-governmental organisations, including Care International, on women's rights. Helen, I'd love to come to you now and ask, tell me about how what Zukiswa said resonated with you, and how do you feel the climate emergency is particularly impacting women at the moment?
Thank you, Natasha, and hello, everybody. Really glad to be in such a forum with people that care about these issues. For me, the relationship between women's rights and climate and the environment are intricately connected, and yet they often aren't. So building on some of the points that Zukiswa made, I think that first one about the fact that there is an exacerbation, or the entrenched existing inequalities are increased when it comes to climate change, is it's a critical first point, really, isn't it? Because I think you can visualize that. You know, I visualize it in terms of an earthquake where you've already got some schisms in society. And then what happens is any crisis, be it the environment, be it COVID or any others, the cost of living ones, all of these often interconnected or building on each other, means that seismic fault lines increase. So if you've got gender inequality already in society, things like COVID increase them massively. They exacerbate the existing situation. And then also the second point that I think is really critical that we hold on to, it's already been said, is the interlinkages that happen across different sectors of society, and the impact in one area flows into, and again, you can use environmental analogy, flows into impacts on other, so housing, poverty, etc. The main points that I wanted to make, I mean, in a way, we started with the fact that the world is androcentric, it's been created, it's man-made. So we're already on the back foot when it comes to any structural systematic issues around gender and around climate and addressing climate. So economically, if you look at financial analysis of economics, it's gendered. There's a feminization of poverty. So inevitably add that to any add that to any climate crisis, and women are disproportionately affected economically. We've already touched on the gendered issues around women in care and looking after young people, the old, the disabled. So whenever you've got an emergency, women are looking after themselves and they're looking after other people. So they're having to think about and address all of those needs. They also might be pregnant themselves. There's a physical, biological factor that is there. There's also the fact that in crises, there's some of the basic roles that they are socially and culturally responsible for, such as food provision, water collection, becomes harder. So the chores of women become a lot harder. Maybe just a couple of more points. Just again, all we are doing is setting the scene, introducing ideas which hopefully can come through in the discussions. But violence against women, early marriage, many factors that are there in society in terms of showing gender inequality are massively exacerbated by any crisis, including climate crisis. We've seen the stats on that, and it's to do with a number of issues. It's to do with greater vulnerability because of movement sometimes. It's to do with stress that is interpreted and reacted to by men in the traditional way through violence on women. Obviously not all, but there is that pattern and that statistics and those generalizations that we see and need to address, and often are not there in the policy thinking. And again, I think that point was already made a little bit around the fact that policymakers tend to be men. So any response to climate tends to not have the gendered lens, and can therefore exacerbate the problems there in the first place. Maybe one last point. And it's one that I learnt about through doing a podcast with a number of women talking about working through crisis. And this was through Amy, who works in Bangladesh. And she said information is gendered. So in Bangladesh, women tend to find it difficult to get information around a climate emergency. Therefore, looking at climate responsiveness in terms of data access was one of the ways in which they were looking at how to make a difference. And I think the main point maybe to take away is how we need to look at all of these different ways in which there's a gender element. It's not through directly just one bit, and that it all is cumulative as a consequence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was amazing to hear from you, drawing on your experiences in that way. And it feels as though there are so many issues coming through, but we also have our own personal experiences of these issues. And Annette, I want to come to you now. I'd love to hear what you feel about what you've just heard from the other speakers. But also, Annette, I wonder if you can talk a bit about your own personal history, how you first became aware of these issues, and why you decided to start taking action on them. Sorry, I should say Annette's joining us from Uganda and is an organizer for Extinction Rebellion Africa.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Hi, everyone. Great to be part of this meeting. Very happy to see the ladies. Ladies are hardworking. They are breadwinners. They meet deadlines. They are decision makers. Homes are like offices. I'm here because of women. Number two, I'm here because of Africa. I'm in Extinction Rebellion because I love to help to see how we can rescue the planet, solely due to the farmers that were hanging themselves in India, Maharashtra, as I helped to see how we could let the world know about them by writing or posting on Twitter about their situation. And who was the main person amongst the victims always affected? It's the women. In Africa, I'm heading Extinction Rebellion as a woman, and we have around the 45 local groups. At least only 5 are being led by female. And what are we fighting for? We are all fighting against causes that are leading the whole planet towards climate change. Why is it that we only have 5 women that are standing in for the local groups? And we have, for example, in DRC around 7 groups, but it's only 2 women out of more than 60 climate rebels that I know that I've seen. Only 2 women. And why all that? We are in a crisis. First of all, it's about human rights. I know I will come to the economic side like my other colleagues have said, but the issue is that less rights have been allocated to a female species. Women do not know that the planet belongs to them yet. And who are these types of women that we are talking about? Not us, not you who is here. Those women who do not have the electricity, they do not have internet, they do not have a smartphone. They are down there, no one knows about them, no one cares. Those are the women that are directly affected by climate change. And we are here to speak for them, which is not exactly the real field. It's that person who receives the problem that can speak or can explain exactly what it's all about. And where is that space? There are no human rights. There's no climate change without human rights. Let us look at the economic side. A local woman, I love speaking using examples because I'm not a good speaker, I'm too technical. A woman is there selling newspapers very early in the morning under a mango tree. But because new economic activities are coming up, and who is driving the lead is the authorities. They want to construct a new big road. They will chase her away, cut the tree, and she runs. Where is she going to run to? Who is that type of woman? Who will she report to? For me, I know what to do. I can wear a cape. I have my rights. I can do what I want. She doesn't know. She doesn't have that feel. So I think the rights issue is very, very important, because if I know I own land, I have the right to fresh air, I will fight against anyone who comes to destroy it. I will fight against anyone who will come to push me out of the land. I will fight against anyone who will come to push me away from accessing clean water, because we have the right to accessing these natural resources. But these women, who are those ones? Not us. They don't know. They feel these things belong to someone. For example, maybe here, they think they belong to the ruling parties, the big people. Maybe they need permission. So it's all about how we make the local lay woman who is directly affected know that they own the rights to their bodies, to the natural resources, to have even freedom of expression and speech. So maybe for now, I can stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette. I think that was, well, it was very moving hearing you speak in that way as well about the women that can't actually be with us tonight. And I think that's very important always to remember that our spaces, you know, are not yet inclusive, even here in the UK. And it's how do we reach out? How do we bring more women into this fight and this struggle? On that note, I'm really pleased to invite our next speaker, who is Chantelle Lunt. Chantelle, lovely to see you. I know that you've been very busy over the last few days, not so much speaking about the climate emergency, but speaking about the policing issue here in the UK, because Chantelle Lunt is a campaigner and activist on racial equality, as well as on the climate emergency. She's the founder of the Merseyside Alliance for Racial Equality. But of course, what we have to remember, what I think all the speakers so far actually have really been opening out for us and bringing home, is how all these struggles are truly interconnected. I wonder, can you open that out a bit more for us, maybe, Chantelle, in the UK context, those kind of intersections?
Thanks, Natasha, and thanks for inviting me on to speak. I think there's often an urge to put civil rights activists under a civil rights umbrella and sort of climate activism under a separate umbrella, but we know that there's those intersections and that the climate emergency is disproportionately impacted and felt by people in the global south, you know, as we've seen from some of our previous speakers. And, you know, people of colour have been not only feeling the impacts of climate change, but banging the drum about it and shouting really loudly about it for decades before it was something that was, you know, really prevalent and, you know, in the UK. And I think for me, I know you touched upon this with the last speaker, but I went to Sierra Leone. I think it was definitely 10 years ago, if not more. And it was at a time when, you know, the climate conversation wasn't as big as it was now in the UK. And it was still described as something which was, you know, really over there. It was really far away. It hadn't got here yet. And it, you know, something that we should be aware of, but not really worry about. And there were just so many things that struck me when I went to Sierra Leone, so many myths that were really bust for me in terms of not only the landscape, the lush green land, the farms, the beauty, the, you know, the beaches, the people. It was a beautiful place, but then also some of the beaches that we visited, there were just waves and waves of bottles and rubbish, and the whole beaches were just covered in plastic. And I was kind of like, what is this? And yeah, it was the waste from the west washing up on the shores of Sierra Leone. And also I was really struck by the fact that, you know, I think some of our previous speakers have talked about women's roles within communities. And, you know, we have it here in the UK and in the global north, but in the global south, it's really clear to see that, you know, women are still guardians of the land, still gatherers of water, gatherers of food. So I was really struck by how many, you know, women farmers I would see, women carrying babies while they were farming and then bringing, you know, the things that they picked into the community and selling them at market. And how a lot of that income was really connected to the land and connected to the climate emergency. So, you know, when we have a flood or if we have a drought, it's often women who are in those frontline positions who really, really feel it. So I think even in terms of displacement, we know that more than 80% of people who are displaced because of the climate emergency are often women. So women are often, I would consider quite frontline in the face of the climate emergency. You know, if we look, I think it's coming up to the 10-year anniversary, maybe, the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, when the factory collapsed, and it was a lot of garment workers who were being paid absolute buttons, but were being not only being exploited, but then made to work in precarious working conditions, and it was mainly women. So when that was all feeds into fast fashion and harm to the environment, but also the exploitation of workers while we're harming the environment. And again, it was women who were impacted by that. So I feel like we often have this real frontline role in feeling the impacts of the climate emergency, but then that quite often positions women as frontline in fighting against what happens, and, you know, being activists, being out there in the community. And so it's no surprise to me that when I go to events celebrating women in climate activism, and to be honest with you, women in any form of activism, people in any form of activism are defaulted to women. It is usually women. It's usually women you see. And it's like, it's not always women only events, but it's women who I'm seeing who are at the front. It's women who are speaking. It's women who are stepping up. And I believe that is quite often because women bear the brunt of it. Women feel the effects first. Women have the impact. And also women tend to have more of a community outlook of reaching out to everyone in the community and thinking about the impacts on everyone and really fighting for what they believe in. And you know, when we talk about those intersections between race and class and things like that, Black women are more likely to be leaders in the community and kind of really strong leaders in the communities and have those real strong leadership skills. But that's not always mirrored in the workplace. So they aren't often given those leadership positions in the workplace despite having all of those skills. But then when we look at women are proven to be better leaders. You know, when we looked at the pandemic, out of over 194 countries that were studied, the ones that women were leading had a better COVID-19 response. When women are put into leadership positions, CO2 emissions in the countries that they are leading are often lower. So I do really think it comes down to that kind of caregiving and community-centric approach that looks at, you know, what are the long-term impacts of our actions. But I think I kind of have two hats on because I have my cultural identity and then me UK identity. And I think that we all, even within, you know, feminist movements and as women, we have different levels of advantage and disadvantage. And I think it's all of our job to bring forward those people whose voices need to be heard the most. So the people like, you know, the farmers in Sierra Leone who've been feeling the impacts of climate justice a long time before it was trending on Instagram in the UK. So I think that's part of our role as women. But, you know, women are absolutely key stakeholders in the climate emergency and should have always a seat around the table, especially women of colour.
Thank you so much. It's just so powerful. There's so many themes there that I really hope we can unpack a bit further, particularly that area of what does women's leadership look like in these movements that are now being built. You know, is a feminist movement different from another kind of social movement? Maybe we'll come back to that in a moment. But before we do, I want to go to our last speaker, last but not least, definitely, Dolly, who joins us from Extinction Rebellion here in the UK, actually in Bristol. I know that Dolly will be well known to many people who have joined this call. Dolly is a former educator. She's a truly inspiring activist who's really taken risks and put herself on the front line. Helen and I were recently at a gathering outside Southwark Crown Court, where Dolly and some other women were facing potential prison sentence for participating in an action, smashing windows, cracking windows at Barclays to protest their involvement in fossil fuel finance. So I have so much admiration for you, Dolly. And I wonder if you could come in now with any response you want to make, but also maybe say something as well about what led you into becoming an activist.
I'm really sorry, but I think Dolly's connection has been lost.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was just thinking I can't see her face above us. What a pity. I'm so sorry. I hope she'll be able to come back. She did actually say to me earlier that she was having to support an action, you know, in the background today, and might have to take a call. So maybe that became more urgent than she realized. Well, what I'd love to do is I'm going to invite the audience to please start putting questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand, but if you put questions in, I can call on you and bring you in and you can make the contribution. So please start doing that. And I'd like to go back to our first speaker, Zukiswa, if that's okay with you, Zukiswa. Just, I wonder if you could open up maybe a bit of that what Chantelle was saying about how because women are so impacted on the front line, they're often taking leadership roles in these movements. What do you see in terms of women's leadership? And do you think women's leadership changes movements?
Sure. Thank you again to my wonderful colleagues who spoke after me. I hope you can still hear me and that the network will survive, because we are having a bit of a time-induced weather situation, so there's a storm. We shouldn't have storms in Joburg in March, just to show that this thing is no longer like an emergency in the sense of, oh my gosh, there's this big monster called climate coming and happening now. To speak to your question, there is absolutely no doubt about how women's leadership is valued and needed, and the difference not only in perspective, right, but also in how women often think through leadership and like leading. And I'll give you an example of the work that we do, for example, at the Women and Gender constituency, where it has been very important for us to ensure that, you know, we build as much of a consensus approach, right, is much of a connected network with the perspectives of women's movements across the world in formulating, you know, our advocacy positions and so forth. It is less often about individual power and who gets to have a platform or sit at a table. But what you find when women are in leaderships, are in positions of leadership, is that there's a sense of how do we bring more of us along, and a feminist consciousness, when you put that together, prioritizes also, you know, who has the mic, right, over and above the quality of what the person who has the mic, you know, has to say. It is very unfortunate, Natasha, that to paint a really bleak picture, when we were at the climate conference, right, last year, it was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, there was a very disturbing picture of world leaders, right, who took like a picture together. And of those world leaders, not only was most of them, you know, of age, right, and not to say that there's a problem with, you know, leading at a certain age, but the reality we continue to face is that we have 70-year-old presidents, 80-year-old presidents, 60-year-old presidents, and there were only 3 women in that picture, right? So in a global conference where most heads of states meet to decide about the future of, you know, billions of people around the world, you can literally count the number of women that are standing there. You can literally count the number of youth, right? Even when you apply a very generous reading of who youth is. And it is absolutely, you know, unacceptable, because not only are young people the ones who are going to inherit the consequences of what those who have come before us, you know, have contributed to the most. We're nowhere near anywhere in terms of what is the future that we so urgently need to deliver. That is a problem. Not only are women as frontline, you know, leaders, as leaders in their households, as leaders in their communities, the ones that are confronting this head on, as some of my speakers have, you know, alluded to. It does not make sense that, you know, you can count the number of heads of state. And that's a different kind of problem, really, because we can also speak about how even our heads of state are so far removed because of the privileges that come with their positions of leadership. But even in day-to-day decision-making around climate policies, the people that know exactly what it means, you know, to not have expedited projects that are funded, that are going to be pushing renewables, right? In a continent, for example, where 70% doesn't have energy. It doesn't make sense that the people who face the consequence of not being able to cook, not being able to assist kids with homework, not being able to access healthcare services because, you know, there is no electricity in the clinic, those people are not at the local level talking about, you know, why this matters. Local chiefs and community leaders who talk about the lack of water, you know, are men. Who is better suited to make decisions about communal water than the people who use water on their day-to-day, not just to care about themselves, but to care about, you know, their children, male children, female children. And so more than, for me, the issue of representation being about, yes, we want to see more women, which women do we want to see, right? Making these policies. It is women who are in communities that are most affected, women who, by the way, are leading already. It is not that we saying that give women an opportunity to lead. Women are already leading. We cannot avoid it. Our lives are such that we lead every single day of our lives. The issue is that where we are meant to be taken where we are meant to have our voices and perspectives taken seriously, we are completely shut out. And so it is up to those of us who are in positions, you know, of collective decision making, those of us who are able to access Zooms, those of us who are able to, you know, have relationships with, you know, big INGOs, relationships with governments, should be insisting more and more that we take responsibility that is required more urgently, and we make sure that we don't give women a voice. Women have a voice, right? We ensure that that voice and that perspective is, you know, brought in and taken seriously in the rooms. Before I close, there was a question in the comments around, you know, is sexism, racism important when talking about climate? Absolutely. The reality of, you know, institutional challenges like sexism and racism is that sexism and racism, you know, decides whose life matters. It has very material consequences to what we do about the problems that we face. So if, for example, a country like the US, a country like Britain, who is considered, you know, amongst those, when we speak about, you know, the people who have contributed the most to the crisis, we know that them thinking about a village in Pakistan or a village in Africa, because people of color are not seen as valuable, right? When a storm hits, you know, the people, are they going to want to pay? Are they going to want to show up? We saw it with COVID. The only reason why globally we were able to respond so effectively and relatively efficiently is because white men, rich white men, for the first time in their lifetime, had experienced something where their money, their race, their gender was not a guarantee in who gets to live or die. And the only reason we found such swift action with vaccination, such swift action with government taking action, is precisely because lives that are rendered more valuable, white, rich, male, were affected. And unfortunately, if we are going to keep moving in this fashion, right, a storm that hits you in a season where it's not supposed to be storming is going to kill you regardless again of your race, your gender, your money. So until we actually take this seriously and start valuing all life with the seriousness that we need, we are going to ensure that we are co-creating a reality where communities are able to be self-resilient and self-reliant enough to do what they need to do to avoid what is becoming an increasingly avoidable path to distraction, for so long as we don't critically deal with the systematic issues that are ensuring that not all of us can participate effectively and meaningfully towards, you know, pushing back against a crisis that is coming for all of us regardless. So I hope that we don't wait for yet another, you know, now is a pandemic, oh my goodness, white men in America are dying, let's make sure we act, right? That's not going to cut it, because when this, reality becomes such that we can't do anything about it, they are not going to even be able to build spaceship, to build life, to have life on Mars, because we don't know if that's possible yet. So absolutely, race, gender, and all the other intersections are crucial because they have a material consequence on whose voice, whose life is rendered valuable enough. And secondly, women absolutely should be making the decisions about our future, because women are feeling the impacts of what a lack of effective decision-making in that arena is costing us. And we cannot continue in that path if we want to survive. Thanks.
Wow, that was amazing. I remember saying, I think it was to Ned before we started this meeting, the problem with meeting on Zoom rather than face-to-face is you can't hear the applause, you can't hear the ripple of energy from the other people in the room, when people make really important points. But I hope, Zukiswa, I hope you heard the ripple of energy that you've created among the participants. I hope you've recognized the impact of your words that I know we'll all take to heart. I just would like to try calling on some of the participants in the room who've put their questions in the chat to actually speak them. We'd like to hear your voices. Michelle, are you able to unmute? And would you be able to put your question yourself to the panel?
Yes, thank you, Natasha. So lovely to be in this space. And I'm feeling like I'm in Africa, Zukiswa. I'm from South Africa too, and I've been living in the UK for a while. So thank you so much for your powerful words. Something that's been bugging me for a while, and I don't know if it's just me, but having worked in domestic abuse support and being very active in the feminist movement here in Oxfordshire, where I live, and I have been engaged in London as well when I was working, supporting victims of domestic abuse. And that was quite a while ago now. And I'm not seeing those people that, were an incredible team supporting women. And I'm not seeing them in the climate movement. And I just don't understand it. So yeah, I was just posing the question, why is it that they aren't here? Is it because they are too overworked? Or is it something else? That's what's been on my mind. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's quite a powerful question. And I think maybe it goes to, is the climate emergency yet really part of mainstream discussion in the women's movement? Obviously, everyone on this call is going to say, yes, we're concerned about that, as well as we're concerned about other issues around women's equality. But I wonder, and I just wonder, Helen, if I could go back to you maybe for an answer on that, because you know the women's movement very well here in Britain. You're also active in issues around the climate emergency. But how much do you feel the women's movement here or elsewhere is really concerning itself enough with the climate emergency?
Yeah, a very interesting question. So let's also hear from others. I think that point made earlier that there's a bit of a schism between those who see themselves as civil rights activists and those who see themselves as environmentalists, or that others see that schism is really true. That's my experience as well. That doesn't mean to say that those who are campaigning on environmental issues don't also understand the importance of addressing violence against women and women's aid, the need for organizations such as Women's Aid and vice versa. But I think there is a prioritization in one or other of those spaces rather than an understanding and a holding them shoulder to shoulder, side by side. I think it is quite difficult to do that. I've often wondered the extent to which the environmental movement parts of it have always had women in it. So you can think of many women leaders from across the world that have had women involved in environmental issues. I wrote down earlier Wangari Maathai, Rachel Carson, Berta Israel Cáceres, Greta Thunberg, Vandana Shiva, Petra Kelly, Caroline Lucas. You can think of women who are right up there at the top of visibility in terms of environmental issues. But then underneath that, in terms of the most involved in policy influence in climate change work, I think it's often been like everything else, so therefore maybe not surprisingly, a lot of men that have dominated the space. I think in terms of the on the streets climate work, it's often been a lot of women. So I don't see that gender numerically less women when it comes to marches and things like that. I've not really seen that. But I think in terms of policy spaces and leadership, both in the more formal policy area and in terms of the activism, there's often been more men, I think. But I am generalizing ridiculously, so it probably doesn't hold any water whatsoever. Fundamentally, I think that all of these things are so interconnected that it's important to try and make those links between civil rights issues, all the intersections of vulnerability and all the abuses of power that hold with that are fundamentally about this planet. And if we don't understand the vulnerability of this planet due to climate and bring those in and find ways to make those connections, I think we are missing the most important thing that needs to be done. Again, that's not to say there aren't other crises that might not hit the world even sooner. You know, we look at economic issues, we look at populism and the cult of single men in certain countries that seems to be increasing, and that might mess up the world even before it comes to environmental issues, or side by side, and they are side by side. That's the point. Maybe, sorry, I'm waffling. These are interconnected, but we often don't see them as interconnected.
Thank you so much. I've just noticed the time, and it's extraordinary how the time is rushing on. I hope that people are looking at these amazing points that are coming into the chat, which are just so important. I wonder, maybe I could call on Sharon, if you were able to unmute, Sharon, and ask your question.
Hi. Sorry,
No, that's great. We can hear you. Yeah.
But I do have a question. Is degrowth something that we could look at, like to address all the inequalities and also protecting our environment at the same time?
Great. I think that's a really important question. It often seems to me, when I look at the theories around degrowth, that that's feminist economics by another name. And I think often if we look back at feminist thinkers of the past, there's a lot that can guide us towards solutions. I'd like to take a couple more questions and points. Pepper, would you like to say something about why you're coming to the big one in London? Pepper?
Yeah. I'm sorry, my video, I'll try and go on video, but
it's fine. We can hear you. That's great. Oh, lovely. We can see you too.
But it keeps going out, so I'll have to come on.
No worries.
Why am I going to the big one in London? Why? I don't understand why anybody would not.
Tell us, for those of us who don't know on the call, what the big one is and why you're going to be there, if you don't mind.
I'm going to have to go off video because I'm pixelating. It's for all the criticisms that get landed about Extinction Rebellion and about people gluing hands to roads and blah, 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 and how it disrupts people's lives. This time, the big one's all about getting 100,000 people round the Houses of Parliament. It's about, and it's for 4 days, 21st of April for 4 days. Okay, lots and lots happening. If you go onto Extinction Rebellion website, you will find all sorts of really, really useful information, and it's family friendly. And some of us who were at Green and Common are going under a banner of Green and Women are everywhere, because we make that connection between feminism and the environment. And we're old enough to have gone there. Okay. So I think it's a move. What's really important about this big event in London is there are 70 other people supporting Extinction Rebellion. It's not just Extinction Rebellion. There's loads and loads and loads of other kind of people concerned about the environment. Okay, and it's really, really important that we go and get this flipping government to take action. And deeds, not words, okay, is what we need.
Thank you so much. I love that connection to women's movements of the past. I think that's really great. I'm going to ask a couple more of the participants to put their points, and then we'll come back to the speakers if that's okay, because time is so short. Inez, I wonder if you'll be able to unmute, and you've got an important point there about leadership and collective action.
Yeah, I mean, I should stress first of all how much I agree with the points made, especially by Chantelle about, yes, women experience climate and disasters disproportionately. In fact, more women die in disasters than men in certain geographical area, but in the majority of disaster, more women die. But what she's saying about which women die, which women suffer most, but also that women are not victims. So that's the main points. What I was wanting to add is that while women's voice as leaders is essential to shape policies, to shape decisions, it is women's collective action that changes the world. We have seen it in the past. There is a completely convincing evidence done, for example, the work that's been done in 174 countries that showed that where you have autonomous women's movements, then you see the government responding to their demands, particularly on GBV, but also on other issues. So strengthening our movements as women across diversities and in solidarity with each other is absolutely essential. And this is also the time to do that, because there is this existential threat, and underneath that is all the racial and gender disparities and difference and inequalities that causes and aggravate what the climate is doing. So collective action by women, that's it.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. I know there is a question from a man in the chat saying, what about the men as well? So that might be something that the speakers also want to pick up on. Or speakers, if you've seen any other questions in the chat that you want to respond to, that'd be wonderful. Because I'd like to come back now, as time is so short, to each of these wonderful speakers. So please respond to anything that participants are putting forward, but also, could you open up for us any sense of hope you have, next steps for yourself or for others, things that you're really hoping for and how you're going to keep that hope alive? Annette, could I come to you first?
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
There was a question posted by Kathy in the chat. Maybe you'll check it out. Talking about the boy child, the gentleman has asked. I am a mother of 4 boys. It's very important. There are also male species who are always affected by climate change, but mostly it's the mother. How do we have a boy child or the male species on board? We first have to empower ourselves as women, break the bridge. The internet has helped a lot. We need to move around, go down deep and discover the problems affecting the women directly affected. Because they are the lead, then they will take care of the male that are affected. How do we do that? Management by moving around. Leave those offices, leave the conference halls, leave the class, because you won't understand the problem of this indigenous species when you are remaining classy. I'm educated, I have makeup, I move around in cars. I think we need to lower ourselves to reduce ourselves to their levels, reduce ourselves to the directly affected local women, our grannies, our cultural leaders, all the ones that are still living in the long ages or in the traditions. I think we need at the same time to break the boundaries, because if you say me, I'm in UK, it doesn't concern me, and me, she's in Uganda, the floods are in Malawi, that's none of my business. I think it all concerns all of us. We hear as if it's the other side, but it's coming. I may be in a comfortable zone, but next time or in a month time or some years to come, climate change is going to sweep away also my situation, and I may not be knowing about it. So I think we need to break the boundaries to take care of the class, throw away the motors, so that we can understand how the problem really pains. Because for me, I've never been in a camp, and after being left homeless, but I've seen women sleeping 100 in one room. Their homes were swept away. The dress she came wearing, it's the same dress she's in today. The gentleman in the camp wants to receive all the items which have been donated, and this woman will remain with the children who are still naked. So there's a lot that is happening that we don't know. We cannot know it all in our comfort zones, in chairs, in classes, and makeup, and traveling in conference halls. I feel we need to break the barrier and move out. And like Natasha said, she believes when she has met physically, not online. Though we still have to think a lot using technology on how we can really take care of other women who cannot take care of themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's very powerful and very sobering to hear about your experiences. Chantelle, I wonder if I can come to you next. And I do notice that there are questions in the chat that we haven't yet really been able to explore, just about these issues of how do we build solidarity and the usefulness of taking action together. I don't know if you'll be able to pick up some of that as well as looking forward for us a bit.
Yeah, there were a few questions that caught my eye. One being about, women in the West speaking for and supporting women in the global South. And I think, we have a role in amplifying voices, but also in getting out the way when women for the global South are speaking. And, in this digital age, there isn't really, and I can see even in this space, there's been space made, which is absolutely incredible, but there isn't really an excuse not to make space for people with lived experience from the global South, because we only have to set up a Zoom link and get people in the room. One of the most powerful talks I ever saw was at the COP26, where people had actually, for that event in Scotland, there were people who were on the front lines in Texas, people on the front lines in India, women who were there in the room speaking from lived experience. And it hit me like it had never hit me before, because there's just something else that is brought when someone who's seen the drought, who stood in the water of the floods, tells you what it is like. And when I was in Scotland doing climate camp, I remember I was speaking about the e-waste piles in Ghana where, Western e-waste is dumped. And I was trying to give this visual picture, and a woman who was in the audience went, "I'm from Ghana," and then stood up and told us exactly what it was like, and did the whole subject more justice than I could ever have done, because I hadn't smelt it. I hadn't, seen people dying, hadn't seen what it was doing to the community where she had. So I think it's a case of, we have climate refugees in our country, we have Zoom, there's many ways that we can ensure the global South and global majority voices are heard, and we just have to make every effort to ensure that we do that. I think Shannon's points about degrowth were really good. They were writing about it in the 70s. We reached our limits to growth. We currently need around 4 planet Earths, I believe, to continue on this trajectory that we're setting upon. And the point is, no one's happy. There's a brilliant book, Happy Cities, which shows how, actually bringing it back and looking at structure and looking at architecture and looking at how we build cities and moving away from looking at, gross domestic production and all of that money as an indicator of happiness, which never is, and actually looking at happiness as an indicator of happiness is better for communities. And it often has a positive impact on the planet. So absolutely, we need degrowth. We need to stop this capitalist hellscape that we're in, where it's just more, make more, consume more, and yet nobody's happy and people are dying and people are starving. It needs to end. And I think, when we're talking about that, it brings me on to the comments a little bit about is it really the time to be thinking about, feminism and racism and all those things when the planet is burning? It absolutely is the time, because what we're doing right now is, and it's something that women are great at, is we are visualizing, and women are visionaries. We need to be able to visualize a new world. And if we cannot visualize a new world, where we have race and gender equality, then what are we fighting for? Like, we may as well not be fighting for the planet. So those conversations absolutely have to come with us, and we absolutely have to make space. You know, I'm the descendant of people who came hundreds of years before me, and we're always told that it's not time for the conversation, yet our people are still dying. Right now is the time for the conversation. And all of those conversations can be had at the same time. Something that's quite beautiful about our movement is, while I might be in, you know, more of a police accountability, Black civil rights space, and my friend might be in an LGBTQ plus space, we will still come together and fight for the planet. Do you know what I mean? We can still bring that expertise to the fight against the climate emergency. And what's more, we can show how it impacts our communities individually, because quite often when we, you know, when we fight for, when Black people are fighting against the cost of living crisis, everyone benefits. But quite often when the cost of living crisis is from the perspective of white people, Black and global majority people don't always benefit. And we can see that from Grenfell. We can see how, you know, lived environment stuff, the fight against the A40, all of that environmental stuff, it was coming from Black and brown people, so it wasn't always taken seriously. So race, gender, all of those things, that intersectionality has to come with the movement. And that kind of brings me on to the point about which Inez raised about intersectionality and also autonomous women's movements. That's something we're seeing quite powerfully if we look at the police. The police are being held to account like never before, and that's massively because of the movement that came after the tragic murder of Sarah Edward and the horrible things that happened there. That was women on the street, women, grassroots women pushing. But it wasn't only women, because we know the Black community have been pushing against the police for generations and saying this too. But what the movement did was it said, you know what, we're pushing over here, but we see you, and we're going to ensure that the door is open for you too, and that conversation is brought in. And we were like, and we see the LGBT community are having a bad experience with the police, and that conversation is coming through. And now we have a report that doesn't just talk about women's experience. It says the police are institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. That shows how an intersectional approach can really bring about change for all communities, and all communities would include us. Whereas if we hadn't had that intersectional approach to activism, it might have just said one thing, and then a lot of communities would have been left behind. So I think we have to embed intersectionality within our movement and really push forward as a community, but with that vision of, you know, we have to be creative in what we are visualizing the world to be. It doesn't have to be this unequal island that we're on now. We can actually visualize this beautiful place where we're all actually living a really good quality of life, if only we were brave enough to dismantle this current capitalist system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was absolutely amazing, Chantelle. Thank you so much. I know that some people are already having to leave the chat, but please do stay with us if you can, just for these last few minutes. Helen, I'd like to come to you next, and I just wonder if you would like to add anything to what you've already said, particularly about looking forward into the future. How do we keep hope alive in these incredibly challenging times?
Thank you. I think that visioning point that Chantelle just made is just so powerful, isn't it? That's how we make change, by keeping hope, by seeing an alternative, by seeing the linkages. Above all else, I think that is the really powerful message that we should take back. I really like the points that were made about collective, women's collective approaches, the history of that, the history of the Greenham Common and other approaches that have seen that. And also, we touched on the way that women have led differently through collaborative approaches, put together collaboration through grassroots autonomous processes and a collaborative leadership in all spaces of policy and all spaces of power. And wouldn't we see something just so much more amazing than what we have at the moment? I did want to touch on the point about the role of men, because that came up. In a context in which we have a man-made world which is problematic, we have an absolute need for male allies that see that and are there and support, active as allies, not just allies saying, there has been a problem and it's important that women speak and we'll take a back seat. That active allyship is about asking, how can I help? And being involved, not just passive. The choices are not be in leadership positions and perpetuate male hierarchies or be passive. It's about looking at ways in which you can still support. So this is a question for you all, and I grapple with it a little bit. A lot of the environmental talk is about disaster and calamity and conflict and chaos and all the rest of it. And of course it has to be. But I also think that there's incredible power in joy and happiness and positivity. And I don't know how we balance those two. I really don't. But for me, I like activism to be about joy. And the more I find that in the way I campaign and the people I'm with, the more effective I feel in getting to that end point. But I know that we have to talk about the problems and the pain and the horror. And I don't know how all of you balance that, but I think finding a way to do that is critical. How do you not despair, because the issues are full of despair? How do you bring joy into tackling despair? I don't know. Maybe two other quick points. One is the journey itself being so important. So whatever we can do, whatever bits that we can do in this journey, the journey is important, even if we can't resolve all of the problems. And these are massive problems and we'll never get to all of them. But if we can value what we are doing, the small steps, even whilst having that larger vision, I think it's really important. And then maybe my last point, which is that it's passing on the baton, isn't it, all of this? And we're all compromised by the way that we live, by the ways that we are not observant of certain power dynamics, by the way that we might be perpetuating the problems in the air miles, etc., etc. I think we need to be humble in understanding that we're all contributing, and still try and do our best and still push for those changes and not be too judgmental about the pitfalls of others, because it's only by holding hands and by passing on the batons to others and by finding ways to be positive in that way that I think we will be most successful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was really inspiring. I know how much you've done to hold the doors open for other women and to build that solidarity in your campaigning life. Zukiswa, I'm going to turn to you now last to give us some closing remarks. And I wonder if, again, would you be able to talk a bit forward, thinking about how we keep hope alive, the hope for the future?
Sure. What a great session. I wrote down some notes. If I read, it's just because I want to make sure that I keep to time. But firstly, I think it's important that, we plug into, as best as possible, existing organizing efforts that are led by frontline communities and organizers, right? And I think we had a colleague, Ines, I think you are the one who made the point around collective action. That's absolutely crucial. Right. And so the point that I made earlier around representation not being just about numbers with regards to how many world presidents are women or how many CEOs are women, it's never about that, because we do know that our strength has always lied in our collective organizing. But it is also important that we recognize that the reason why the strength of this collective organizing, that evidences positive leadership that has taken us forward. The reason why this is not reflected, in leadership spaces and spaces of influence at national, global, or regional or global level is precisely the work of patriarchy, right? There's no shortage of examples of women's leadership and how effective women's leadership is. There's a shortage of where women are able to take that leadership and put it forward in ways that can make, a meaningful impact, not just in their own communities, but across the board. And so while we should absolutely, spotlight and uplift the ways that women's collective organizing at local levels, at national levels, has taken us forward, we should absolutely criticize why we are still, speaking about where are women, where decisions about our day-to-day lives are made. Why are women always having to respond, to crises after the fact, when we have shown, throughout history, that we aren't just able to lead after the fact. We can lead, towards solutions before the crises. So that point that I'm driving home is that where, those efforts are being pursued, let's support them with our pounds, with our dollars. Let's motivate, in our spaces of influence, wherever we might be, that resources be directed, to frontline communities who are at the forefront of, the response to this crisis, even as their leadership is not reflected as such. Secondly, I wanted to say that, what leadership do we want reflected, right? It is, number one, rightly so, women's collective action, right? And women's visions, right? Women's visions, thinking around policy, women's solutions that are going to take us towards a fossil fuel, anti-capitalist, violent-free, and gender-just future. Because one thing about crisis that is true for any crisis is that it also presents, an opportunity. What is the opportunity here? Evidence that the ways that we have been living, right, under capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy is not working, right? It was never meant to work. The system is not broken, right? It's functioning as it is. And as a result of a system that has never been suited, to accommodate human life, joy, love, laughter, we have an opportunity here to usher the world into a different future. And that future, lies at, what I'm saying about, an example of how women have led. Women are leading through, gender just climate solutions that they are offering, that are responding to the needs of their communities, that need to be supported, to be scaled up, that need to be supported, to be writing reports on these, so that, we document this and we produce it as evidence, to the people who are responsible for making these decisions, to say that we know that we do not have to live like this. We know that we do not need to depend, on fossil fuel generation, because there are examples of gender just solutions out there that we are just not wanting to listen to. Women are also leading, with communal financing mechanisms where they are farming and feeding each other in their communities in ways that are harmonious with nature. Women are leading through care work as praxis that is responsible for building the bridge between state policy failure, whilst also modeling how life outside of the brutality of capitalism and patriarchy is possible, right? This is leadership. Right, women's collective organizing has been responsible for reducing child mortality rates, child marriage, improving education and health outcomes, minimizing the frequencies of war, and so many examples. There is no reason why we should not insist on women's perspective and collective action being taken seriously as a model of leadership that can contribute, must contribute to actual policy, to actual budgets at the state, regional and global levels. And so women's stories of collective power and resistance are beautiful and incredibly generous. But the logic that we use these stories as inspiration for how local women in some village in Uganda or South Africa or somewhere in Mexico are doing incredible things without questioning why, we are so happy to keep that organizing at the local level and be happy with the feel-good story without questioning why are those women in Uganda, for example, not able to access spaces of influence and a lead in those spaces as well. Because women's leadership should never be contained or seen as a cute story of this is amazing, this is beautiful. It is not just that. Women's leadership, women's activism, is a model of opportunity for the rest of the world, which can be learned from. So especially for folks who are in developed nations, for example, speak up with your dollars and pounds, speak up with the ways that you are in solidarity with movements and organizations elsewhere, speak up with the ways that you are able to hold your governments accountable, listen to the demands of the global South, and small island countries around what their visions for a climate justice is, and how you can play a role in lobbying and ensuring that governments of developed nations actually account and come to the party to ensure that we deliver a different future that is so incredibly urgent. So absolutely, collective power, collective organizing is crucial, but we must also insist that those perspectives are reflected in the kinds of policies that are ultimately responsible for whether or not we're going to get out of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so, so much. What a blast of energy that was. If anyone here is asking the question, how do we keep hope alive in these dark times with all that we're facing? I really hope that, like me, others on this call have felt inspired by these amazing speakers. When I first started getting active with Extinction Rebellion, I was in a pretty despairing place, a pretty dark place. And I do feel that through the activists I've met, their energy, the solidarity, the hope, the drive, it really has reawakened hope for me. And I really hope that some of you, I'll be seeing some of you out on the streets for the big one or other protests locally. And thank you so much to all our speakers, particularly those who are joining us from outside the UK. I have to say, it's so incredibly important for us to hear your voices. It really, really reminds us of what women are going through on the front line of this emergency. It reminds us that despair is a luxury that we cannot afford. We have to take action, not because we're sure that change is going to come, but we know that change won't come if we give up now. So I really, really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking time in what I know are very, very busy schedules, very pressured lives. And also massive thank you to Chantelle and to Helen for joining us. You've been very inspirational to me over the years, and it's just great to hear your voices in this context. I'm so sorry that Dolly had to drop out of the call due to tech problems. Please give us feedback on social media, email, however you want to stay in touch. Thank you so, so very much for joining us this evening. I'm going to say goodbye now. Goodbye to you all.